So all this territory from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, is now part of the United States. And one of Jefferson's proposals is that slavery should not be allowed in any of this territory. And I mean, what an amazing proposal when you think about it. Because had it passed, the future states of Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and presumably Louisiana and Missouri and Texas, right, would not have been slave states.
Yeah.
And it fails by just one vote.
All right, so we declare independence. What's it like the next day? Do we have any idea what happened the day after? Like, what was he doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, what was Jefferson doing?
Yeah.
Jefferson continued on for a while as a member of the Continental Congress, but I think that he and, his great partner in the enterprise of independence, John Adams, I think both of them shared the sense that now that independence is achieved, the important work is elsewhere. The important work is not in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
The important work is in Williamsburg. The important work is in Boston. It's in the capitals of these 13 new United States, where we have the opportunity to come up with new constitutions and reform the laws and essentially, purge ourselves of monarchy and become, this nation of 13 real republics.
Yeah. So what was actually his first job in government then after that?
So he went back to Virginia. He was a member of the legislature. He soon thereafter became the governor of Virginia. He served two terms. He looked at reforming the laws. Some of his reforms were successful. Others were unsuccessful. Jefferson did not have a great win-loss record as far as his legal proposals were concerned.
Interesting.
The first bill that he co-sponsored as a member of the House of Burgesses, in 1769, was a bill that would have made it legal for Virginians to voluntarily free their slaves. And that measure was voted down, and Jefferson and his partner in that enterprise were sort of shouted down as enemies of the colony.
Yeah. Do you know roughly what year that was?
That was in 1769.
Okay, 1769. Yeah. So let's talk about his feelings about slavery and everything else. I mean, when I've talked about this on the show, I say that, as I said to you earlier, he was a complex man of his time. He owned slaves while he was writing the laws to free slaves. They address at Monticello that he probably had relations with at least one slave, possibly. Or is that cleaner now? Do we know anything specifically?
I don't think anyone. So the woman's name is Sally Hemings.
Yeah. And
it appears, it's not 100% slam dunk, but the evidence adds up to the strong probability that Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who was his late wife's half-sister, had a multi-decade monogamous relationship that yielded a number of children. So, I mean, just in that description, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, she was the half-sister of his late wife. I mean, this is Virginia family trees were oftentimes tangled vines. And, Jefferson's father-in-law was the father of this enslaved woman, Sally Hemings.
Wow.
And when Jefferson's wife passed away, according to family accounts, on her deathbed, she made Jefferson promise that he would never remarry. In part because her mother had passed away and her father remarried. And it seems as if she, never really felt as if she was regarded in the same way as her new stepsisters. And she didn't want that to happen to her own daughters. So Jefferson made this promise. And a couple years later, he's in France with his daughters, and he sends for the youngest of his daughter to join them in Virginia, join them in France from Virginia. And he, by name, requested this elderly African-American woman to accompany his youngest daughter, but she was sick. So his family back in Virginia instead sent Sally Hemings to serve as a babysitter. So, after her arrival, at some point, maybe in France, probably in France, their relationship began. And, here's this woman who probably resembles Jefferson's wife. Sally Hemings is 3/4 white. She is, from home, right? She represents family. She represents Virginia. But she's also this rare thing. She's, a young Virginian who's with him in Paris, this incredible metropolis. There aren't many white women in Virginia who've seen what Sally Hemings has seen, who speak some French, who've experienced this important part of his life with him. And so he can't legally marry her, right? He can't violate his wife's promise with Sally Hemings because by law, she could never become his wife.
God, there's so much there. All right, so obviously we're going to sort of bounce in and out of the slavery discussion there. But so France, was he the ambassador at the time? Is that?
Yeah, he was. I think so. I mean, so he went over there initially. He was Benjamin Franklin's understudy. And then when Benjamin Franklin left France, Jefferson was elevated to serve as our ambassador. They had this weird term for it back then. He was our minister plenipotentiary.
Really?
Yeah.
That sounds
fancy title.
That is very fancy. That is very fancy.
Yeah.
So give me just the line from working in the legislature in Virginia to then becoming president, just so we get that sort of piece out.
So he is the governor of Virginia. He then agrees to serve as one of Virginia's representatives in Congress under the Articles of Confederation. It's at this point in 1784 that Jefferson proposes a law, the Ordinance of 1784, that is going to regulate all of this territory that has been recognized as part of the United States as a result of the Treaty of Paris, which ends the War for Independence. So all this territory from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, is now part of the United States. And one of Jefferson's proposals is that slavery should not be allowed in any of this territory. And what an amazing proposal when you think about it. Because had it passed, the future states of Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and presumably Louisiana and Missouri and Texas, right, would not have been slave states.
Yeah.
And it fails by just one vote.
Now, again, at that time, he owned slaves.
He did.
And this is why I think it's so interesting and how we're all just people of our time. Do we know anything about his inner thinking about that? Like I think there's a certain amount of people, and I've talked about this with people, that'll say, well, why didn't he just free his slaves then?
Yeah.
Why didn't he just let them go?
So for a while...
If he really felt that abolition was the way to go.
For a while, it wasn't something that was legally doable.
Yeah.
I mean, again, as a result of the failure of that first public act, the act to allow for the voluntary emancipation.
Right. So he
of slaves.
legally.
So for a while, he legally couldn't free them.
Yeah.
And then, by the time it was legal for Jefferson to free them, you could make the argument that technically he didn't even really own them. Jefferson inherited from his late father-in-law not only a large number of enslaved people, including Sally Hemings, right, and her family, but also a tremendous amount of debt. And, that debt essentially just snowballed over the course of his life. He also co-signed a loan with the governor of Virginia, who passed away. So then Jefferson was on the hook for about $20,000 of debt. He was also, let's be fair, he was a high roller. I mean, the largest library in the Western Hemisphere doesn't come cheap. And, he liked his furniture and his art and his wine. And by the time Jefferson died, he was, I think, about $105,000 in debt, which in today's money is, between like $1 and $2 million.
Right.
And so his slaves really were owned by his creditors. And, I don't mean to say that to get him off the hook, but I think it's important to realize, too, that Jefferson and the issue of slavery are never going to be the only issue, right, that he's trying to tackle. And when you get past the 1780s, and, to go back to the trajectory of his life, after he's done in France, he's summoned by Washington to come back to the nation's capital and serve as our first Secretary of State. And we know that in the 1790s, Jefferson is very quickly going to get embroiled in disagreements with, his colleague, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. And Jefferson essentially views the Constitution in a specific sort of way. He thinks that if the Constitution, gives the national government a specific power, then it has that power. But if it doesn't specifically receive that power in the text of the Constitution, he thinks that the power should remain in the hands of the states or the people. And Hamilton clearly has a different vision.
Yeah. So in our lens of 2018, he really was a constitutional conservative, right? Like,
yeah,
he really believed if it's in that text,
right,
that's the power that's delineated, but nothing else. Hamilton felt you can sort of extrapolate.
Yeah, I mean, Hamilton thought that, if something could be deemed necessary and proper, and Hamilton, has a point too, because remember, the Constitution, it wasn't created to make the government weaker, right? I mean, it was a victory for nationalists and centralizers relative to the Articles of Confederation. And Jefferson was part of that. I mean, he wanted this new Constitution to be ratified, as did James Madison, his chief political ally in the 1790s. But they thought that Hamilton was taking it too far. And that if this Constitution was going to mean anything, right, it had to mean what it actually said.
Yeah.
And so this struggle, right, between Jefferson and Hamilton is in some ways regionalized. And Hamilton's supporters are chiefly in the North, and Jefferson's supporters are chiefly in the South. And, I don't think it's a surprise that once you get into the 1790s, by and large, Jefferson's actions against the institution of slavery begin to get muted, right? Because he needs to win this battle to preserve the liberty of the new United States. And he really thinks that's what's at stake. I mean, he thinks that Hamilton is essentially this crypto-monarchist.
Right, that slowly he's going to just expand the government.
That he's a counter-revolutionary.
Right.
Right? I mean, if we're going to preserve the liberty of white Americans, that we can't then rock the boat on the issue of slavery and undermine, right, this coalition that he and Madison have created, which has its basis in the American South.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.